Hey yo everyone, gather round. It's story time. Brought to you by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, Department of Social Work, and Conscious Party Productions. You are listening to The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast.
A conscious party.
Revolutionizing our minds.
Elevating our consciousness.
Changing our worlds.
Your story.
My story.
Our story.
All right. Welcome to another episode of The Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I see there's a couple of you in the audience, so feel free to say what's up or hello. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to chime in throughout. But I feel very honored to be joined by Phillip Ablett and Christine Morley, all the way from Australia.
Yes, and likewise, Christian, with you.
Just to give a little background on the Revolutionary Social Work book here, that's how I became acquainted with both Phillip and Christine. They have a chapter that they wrote in a book, an international book called Revolutionary Social Work. It's essentially about reimagining higher education and social work. Well, I was wondering, first of all, how did you get into that book? How did that come about?
I think we were just invited.
Yeah.
I think
Masood Kamali, who also embraces the term revolutionary social work. He's based in Sweden, and a number of other critical social workers, both from the global north and the global south, were asked to join. Would we be interested in participating in interrogating and finding examples, I suppose, of this notion of revolutionary social work? They're not two terms that are often brought together, revolution and social work. So we found that challenging, and we had things we wanted to say, particularly on education.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you mentioned it, because you know, social work and revolution. And I think even a better word to use is Dr. Paul Michael Garrett's dissenting social work. Dissent and social work seem to be antithetical to each other at times. At least it's hard for me to put it in a global perspective, but at least here in the United States of America, dissent and social work seem to be opposing factors.
Yeah, there's a lot of conservative pressure, I think, on social work. And Paul Michael Garrett is right. Like, we absolutely need to find ways to become more dissenting. Yeah.
I mean, the dominant social work, what we call establishment social work in our textbook, demands conformity, and I think it's even getting more the case with changes we're seeing in our own context, which we can elaborate on, but whereby, and there always has been, of course, I think it's always been dominant, although it's contested, this notion of social work as fixing allegedly dysfunctional individuals in the service of the state or the status quo, political status quo, making people functional to fit in and, to manage them. And that leads to things like, coercion, policing the poor, and a social work that we don't identify with.
I guess there's a lot of emphasis on the evidence-based biopsychosocial assessment and the risk assessment, and practice in Australia has, I think risk assessment has probably become one of the most central practices for mainstream social workers, a requirement of their organisation. So we spend all this time policing people, looking at risk to determine who's worthy of resources and who's not, rather than perhaps challenging the fact that we need to be advocating for more resources and dismantling the structures that create that disadvantage.
And I think there's a long history of this. There's always been a social work that looks at reforming individual character, that's heavily casework based, and I'm not dismissing all forms of casework or individual work. It's really important, in fact, to have something that might relieve immediate personal suffering. I think that's part of what we do. But to do that without any awareness of the social forces that produce that suffering, that condition it, and to have some ideas about how you might change that is really to go into social work with one arm or, all of one's limbs constrained.
We really become part of the problem. We're embedding a status quo that is inequitable, that is unjust, that disadvantages the most, marginalised groups. And if social work doesn't have an analysis about that, and I know your ideas about revolutionary social work extend beyond radical and critical, but I think some of that analysis is really important, in any kind of construction of revolutionary social work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's slow down just a little bit, and let's save that, and let's talk about critical social work and what that means. I think, again, it's hard for me to place on a global context, but words like, or terms like critical social work, revolutionary social work isn't even used in the United. I'm the only one that uses it pretty much.
It's not widely used in Australia either. I think probably, most people don't use it. Yeah.
And then critical social work, let me put it this way. When I was going for my master's degree, I was in a graduate class, and everybody would turn to me as the expert on critical social work, and I didn't know anything. I just knew a few things about it. And so it shows how little it's engaged with here in America. And I think it goes back when we talk about education. To receive your master's in social work, an MSW, most people in here, they go through an advanced standing program to where they get to cut down a 2-year degree to 1-year degree. But what that does is forces them to take 5 graduate classes plus an internship for the entire year, five classes for 2 semesters, so 10 classes total, and an internship where they got to spend about 25 hours a week most of the time unpaid, almost always unpaid. And so if you're supposed to be spending what they say, and there's different numbers that they get, but say you're supposed to spend 10 hours a week in a graduate class. Well, if you do the math and then you add the internship and you add a family or you add a job or taking care of yourself, well, you don't have really much time to reflect and dissent or explore these ideas, even when you're talking about on larger social justice issues. I know we talk about them a lot in social work, but oftentimes we're so incapacitated that we don't have the time. And then if you took that further and you had somebody who graduated, well, they'd be very worried about passing their licensing exam. If they wanted to become a clinical social worker, they'd be very worried about getting their clinical hours, getting their supervision. And even backing up to the degree is when I went to the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but one of my biggest criticisms was that essentially that they were mostly trying to produce people to either go down the career path of a therapist or a caseworker or a case manager, like you said before. And I had always looked at social work as something bigger. And I don't mean to diminish that. I just mean, I'm not saying none of those, because my wife's a clinical therapist, so I'm not diminishing those things, but my idea of social work was always bigger, more of an art that you could apply in different ways. But here in the United States of America, it seems that it's being reduced to simply a profession where you take one of 2 paths, and there might be a little bit more thrown in there. But I guess the 2 points I wanted to make is, one, that you don't have time to dissent or think about those things. And on the other hand, it's just not encouraged in any way, shape, or form. How does that compare to Australia?
There's a strong tendency to follow that path. Look, the sort of social work that we try to teach and engage with is one that's aware of social analysis, of course, but also our history, that we try to teach our students, at least expose them to a knowledge that social work was originated in the context of the advent of industrial capitalism in the 19th century and the profound impact that's had on the world that we live in, that we inhabit, and that it created enormous inequalities, material inequalities that are still with us. I forget the global figures, but so many billionaires, and it's a handful, own as much material wealth as half of humanity. So we're getting into a ridiculous state with inequality, although it was cushioned somewhat in Western or the global North in the post-war era. But all of that is unravelling now, and we're facing those pressures again. And there are other forms of oppression besides that, the material inequalities of capitalism. But so social work was a response to that. It was meant to address what was called the social problem. And so that's what I meant with, yes, there's always been an individual ameliorative component, but if you go back to Jane Addams and the founders of social work in the United States, for example, there was always a social component about how do you counter some of these forces and bring about social reform, to engage in some sort of social reform work, social policy work, and that involves social activism, advocacy in relation to changing legislation, people's rights. So somehow we have to hang on to that, and we have tried to incorporate that in the sort of programs we teach. But there is this, as you said, narrowing pressure, and what gets privileged by things like our professional association, which very much privileges the risk assessment, the treatment modalities, and that kind of narrows us back to an almost therapeutic clinical intervention mode. And even though we might have some broad awareness of these other things, and the term social justice is used, but we don't teach, it's not prescribed in the standards what strategies we should be using to achieve those social justice and human rights outcomes. It's all clinical strategies that are privileged. Sorry,
I would just say with the narrowing of education as well. Like, there's just a lot of emphasis on the latest pedagogy, or the generative AI and how we'll use that in social work, or the latest Canvas site. But in terms of critical reflection and critical analysis, like, we have a very strong emphasis on that. We see those things as absolutely fundamental and core to social work, and everything else can kind of, often be learnt in practice. But if you don't have that framework of critical analysis and critical reflection, then that's a real problem, because you're likely to be captured by dominant discourses and potentially just become a functionary for the state, or for neoliberal discourses, or for other dominant kinds of discourses that produce oppression. And yes, our professional association is very much, they've just released a new set of standards last week, and that takes us much more down a narrow, conservative, clinical type of path, very much focused on registration. The registration that they're seeking is with, a very narrow health body that doesn't recognise things like community development, policy analysis, advocacy, social action as core functions of the social work profession in Australia. And so that path would very much be narrowing. My understanding is that registration, probably won't go forward at that national registration for APRA, which is the health kind of dominated for health professions. But we are looking at state-by-state registration, which could have a broader scope of practice for social work. But also the similarities, I guess, with the states in what we're kind of seeing at the moment in Australia is perhaps a move to dumb down social work education in universities, perhaps even see it go into the TAFE sector with the standards that have been put out by the ASW that remove requirements, for example, to have professorial leadership, to have research active academics, to have no protections around minimum staffing requirements. And so in a marketised environment in higher education, those standards are, a gift to neoliberal managers who want to cut costs. And so if we would see a reduction in the quality of education and our professional body at the same time, which has moved away from being a member association to a company, and they're, selling their product almost in competition with universities, and so that's where you can become an accredited mental health practitioner, or an accredited disability worker, or an accredited aged care practitioner, or an accredited domestic violence practitioner, whereas we have a generic degree in Australia currently that in theory, qualifies students who become graduates to work in any field without needing further qualifications. So we're seeing a move towards this credentialing notion, and if social work education is reduced to the point where it no longer can do that effectively, then it's a very good business model for our professional body that clearly has a conflict of interest in relation to the standards that they've put out, which very much, reproduce that neoliberal corporate model of social work.
I mean, in that chapter that you cited, we focused on education because we thought, and we still do believe, that education is one of the few terrains where you have the capacity to speak openly and challenge, nudge, confront the conservative forces that we encounter that are the source of so much oppression, to put it really simply. I mean, neoliberal discourse that everything has to conform to a capitalist market framework in order to be valued. The other forms of oppression that are exacerbated by that, whether they're to do with gendering or racialisation, around age and so on. So, we thought education is a terrain of contest and struggle, and we still aim to keep it that way.
Contest and struggle.
Yeah, as indeed practice is, fields of practice, but we shouldn't underestimate the forces that are seeking to control those spaces and impose a dominant model.
Can I just say, Christian, too, in terms of that time to reflect thing, because that's a difficult thing, because if we don't take time to reflect, if we don't stop and think about what we're doing, then, as I said, we might just end up participating in dominant discourses that capture us and perhaps become functionaries of oppressive, social forces rather than change agents in relation to those same forces. So one of the things that we, really insist on is that students do that. So if people are saying, well, we don't have time to reflect, then I'll be like, well, you think about your practice, don't you? So in order to think about practice, like, practice is, it's a moral, it's an ethical, it's a political, thing. It's not just a technical thing. So in order to have a holistic, approach to practice, you actually do need to think about it. So do you think in a way that just reproduces dominant ideologies, or do you think critically about your practice? And so, we will have specific units, entire units, not just as an adult, but like a really deep kind of engagement with critical reflection on a practice incident, where students, for example, identify an incident where they feel that they either can't implement critical practice in the organisation because of institutional bureaucratic constraints, or, they struggled to link critical theory with practice, or, they felt it might be that they just felt disempowered by a supervisor, or, something like that. But we look at that I guess, just discursive construction of their critical incident and really unpack that using both critical and postmodern theories to try and look at, well, how am I constructing this problem? How do I position myself in relation to what this problem is? I guess it's about how we ourselves participate in our construction of what the abstract structures are that are perpetrating this particular reality on us that might make us feel disempowered. So we're always trying to use critical reflection in a way that connects students with a sense of the means of social change so that they can be active agents within their contexts. Because without that, if they feel disempowered, and often neoliberalism as a top-down discourse, one of the most dangerous discourses, of course, is there is no alternative. And of course, there are always alternatives. It serves dominant interests for us to think that there's no alternatives. And so that's where we become a bit dissenting, I guess, in how we think about some of those alternatives and how we begin to take action to resist.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And when you're talking there, I had a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of questions that I could ask. But one thing that it makes me think about is, I call it becoming a part of it. And oftentimes when you go to any kind of education, but social work education fits here as well, it's deemed as something that, the professor or the major organizations that configure our education here in the United States, they act like it's only something that is given to you or something, like Paulo Freire and the transfer of education, the banking model of education. And as a matter of fact, I've been to, let's say, like a decolonizing workshop, or I went to an anti-racist, I can't remember what it was called, but it was how to make our curriculum anti-racist. And the major issue that I had with these events were that they used the banking model. And so they went up there, you had somebody that stood up there in front of you and they told you what you're supposed to know. And they even mentioned talking circles once, and then they got distracted and they just brushed by it. And I'm thinking the whole time that the only way that we can really become a part of it is to actually be a part of it and talk about these things, as in we're active agents and also producers of these things. We play a role in it. It's just not something that's given to us. And you see that in education, but you also see it just in social work in general. You could tie it to the social work education, but it's something that, you're trying to go and get this licensure, this education, you're trying to acquire all these things. You're going to take an exam that shows that you're fit for it. And then you're going to move on and go participate in some agency where you're going to take whatever, usually a corporation often, or some state agency, whether it's Child Protective Services or even working with the police now. My point is that it's something that they give to you versus something that we're active participants in. And even if you think about going back to what I was saying about an advanced standing degree and having all these obligations at the same time, and then graduating and having to pay off your student loans, you got to take high caseloads or make extra money. Well, we don't often have time, and we're not encouraged to become a part of it. Actually, we're encouraged to go the other direction, and just to take in all these things and be what has already been preordained and produced for us, rather than being an active participant in there. And I know you talked earlier, Philip, about methods as well in higher education. You both touched on them a little bit. But again, one of the things that I've used is talking circles. And it's I learned them from Alaska Native. So it's rooted in indigeneity, but really anyone can do it. It's essentially just a circle where folks sit around and they talk. So it's nothing super ceremonial or esoteric or anything like that. It's very simple. And what I found is that if you do that, students may be a little anxious and conservative and reserved at first, but through modeling it myself and the other students modeling it, that they start to open up, and slowly but surely they become a part of it. And it becomes, I look at it like this: when I went to the Alaska Native circles, it was like I went there and it was my story and their story. And I thought that, let me just put it this way. At first, I was very resistant to it. And then after having to spend time listening to each other, sharing sometimes myself, well, I became a part of it. And it was no longer their story and my story, but it was our story. Yes. And once we got to that point, we were able to really co-create knowledge and grow, essentially what I would say, grow closer together. But with the current methods often used, basically the banking model of education, in social work education, but also in kind of what should be more revolutionary movement type of things, they still are using the banking model. And if you go back here in America, and if you look at movements that were successful, they incorporated the people and they made the people a part of it. I mean, like a good example might be like, say, the Black Panther Party back in the 60s and 70s. Obviously, they had leadership and whatnot, but it was very inclusive to where they're building relationships and they're co-creating knowledge together. And if you fast forward to today, I think something like Black Lives Matter, and in that way, has had a lot of positive results as far as shifting the way that people think, helping people get involved and looking at it in different ways. But in the same way, I'd say it's been reduced to where, not in every situation, but many situations, to where it's something that it's co-opted by the very powers that be, and then it's something that's a transfer of knowledge from the people that know to the people that don't know. But we all come with knowledge and experience and wisdom, and sometimes what we're taught is counter to those lived experiences, and we're just kind of told to swallow it. And now we can change our perspective and we can look at our lived experience differently, but we have to have folks that engage with us, and we have to be able to feel like we're playing a role in that. And too often we look past that in social work. I just wondered if you all had any thoughts about that.
Over to you.
Well, our Australia's Indigenous people talk about yarning, and it's very similar in some respects to what you're talking about with...
You said yarning?
Yarning. Telling a yarn. Yarning, it's an Australianism, but talking. And talking in a way that's shared. So your talking circles, that sort of concept, there are similar things that happen here. I guess what I really like about what you're saying is enabling students to take responsibility for their learning and to participate and getting them to reflect. And I think what Christine was saying about teaching critical reflection by getting them to, I suppose, identify a critical incident and then give you a litany, I suppose, of what their immediate construction of what happened was, and then going through the critically reflective process. But she's the best person to talk about that. She is a leader in that space. All I was going to say is that one method, if you like, that I do with my social theory or theory students in the master's level is from about the second week, I give a lecture, I'll give a lecture on Marxism, Marx, on, other critical thinkers. But what I do in the workshops, in the tutorials, is from week 2, I have 2 discussants or 3 discussants from amongst the students, and I want them to identify a concept, apply it to either a social issue or a practice scenario, and to lead the discussion. Now, that's a big ask, but I've just found it so productive. I can sit back, I do the assessment, but I'm just one participant in the classroom. And the level of engagement and the level of deep discussion that develops from that, once we establish trust, I did have a situation where we have a lot of international students in our master's program. I had a lot of students from mainland China, and I'd given a lecture on Marx, and a lot of them were thinking, oh no, we came here to get away from that. But once they saw the intention, which was to identify the emancipatory aspects of Marx, Marx's questions about capitalism, that's why I still bother with Marx. He asked good questions about why are we, living in the wealthiest society in history in terms of material goods that impoverishes the very people that produce that wealth, and it leads to increasing inequality. So in terms of those questions, he's still a living thinker for us, because that's not solved. And the students grasp that eventually, and they begin to build their confidence in saying, well, I think this or that. So they lead the discussion on Marx, and they'll pick a concept like class inequality or alienation from the readings. I've found that, they, in their feedback, say this was really empowering. And we might look at Freire, we might look at feminist thinkers, anti-racist thinkers, Indigenous, queer theorists and thinkers, and how that might apply in practice. And I found giving them control early on in their learning is actually enormously productive.
And goes against, I guess, the culture of just being passive consumers of knowledge, which we've seen so much of develop in various ways. So people don't have to think. You don't have to think about things. You can just do a Google search or use generative AI, and it'll come up with the answer for you. But we really want people to think. And I've always taught critical reflection, for the last 25 years or something, and have had students that are really engaged. But I found that during COVID, when we went into lockdowns, and for the first time our face-to-face students became online participants, and I was flooded with this sea of cameras that were turned off, and thinking, and that's when it really hit home for me how much my classes are really about co-constructed knowledge, and how much I, as an educator, as a critical educator, deeply rely on engagement with and participation from my students, because as I was sitting in front of them with this blank view of sort of, black, Brady Bunch type screens, I found myself really pleading with them not to just be passive consumers of knowledge, that actually critical pedagogy requires you to actively participate in these classes, in the shaping of what we learn together. I mean, I can plant the seeds, I can facilitate ideas, I can expose you to critiques, I can prompt you with questions, but I need your active engagement, and I need you to do this for each other. And this is about the learning of practice skills when we pose those deconstruction questions that aim to, identify hegemonic assumptions or other types of assumptions that have been guiding practice that you haven't been aware of. For example, like I need many brains in this room because together we'll generate more perspectives. And so, we just started to have a bit of a rule. I don't normally impose rules, but it became unless there's a technical problem or there's some kind of major thing going on today and you can't have your camera on, then let's have our cameras on, because that's how we show up for each other. And this is a learning community. We're a community of activist learners, and so we can't become that. We can't do that without seeing each other, without engaging, without actively participating. And so I'm quite an advocate of online learning now, but it did take some, I guess, thinking and advocacy around what would make that work so that it could be still a critical pedagogic space.
Yeah, the camera issue is, I think, for all of us that teach online, it becomes an issue because I try to empathize with my students, for example, and I think, well, geez, I have to spend a lot of time on the computer. And sometimes I like to turn the screen off so I don't have to have people watching me and looking at the screen. But the simple fact of the matter is it's really hard to have deep discussion, dialogue, be meaningful participants if we can't see each other and the cameras aren't on. So I see both things, but the courses that I've had where the cameras are on are significantly better than the ones where you can't see each other. So it's a fine line to walk, I think. But also,
I did have somebody say to me, I'm just at the doctor's, and so I'm just waiting to go into the doctor's room. And I'm like, well, then you can't be in class. You need to go and do the thing that you need to do with the doctors, and we'll see you next week, when you're well. But this isn't, classes are not a podcast. They're an active engagement. So in order to participate, there is an expectation that you will come and that you won't be engaged in, paid work while you're serving customers or, kind of tuning in whilst you're doing other things. Yeah, I think that's an important requirement, I guess, that we are. And it's the same requirement of democracy, right? For it to be able to work, people need to be informed and participate. It's not just about having the right, it's about,
exercising.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, let's, how do I say this? Let's make some of this more easily accessible for some of the people that might listen that don't have the vocabulary yet that we have. I remember when I was in grad school, I was actually, if you know who Angela Davis is, the old civil rights icon, she came and taught our class for a semester. But in that class, I started to hear words that you don't usually hear in the social work environment, words like neoliberal and hegemonic and many other words. But I was in there and I really had to listen closely and then go back and, think more deeply on these issues. But we've talked in here a lot about, say, critical reflection. And I think there's a lot of people that may listen to this and know this on them that just haven't come across some of these words. We know what reflection is, but what makes it critical reflection?
The emphasis on power. That's the difference. It's not just simply looking at, what did I do in my practice and what could be different, or what, might have changed, or what did I think was good and what did I not think was good. There's an emphasis on power that makes it critical, and always that emphasis on, trying to produce more democratic, socially just aims, critical aims, emancipatory aims for the client, for yourself, in the context of your organisation and so on. So that would be one thing. But the other thing that I think defines it, and I use largely Jan Fuchs' model of critical reflection and Stephen Brookfield, I've been very influenced by his work as an adult educator on critical reflection as well. It's the idea that the telling of the critical incident and the story that we tell ourselves about whatever has occurred in practice is literally just the beginning. Like, that's just one construction, because postmodernism tells us that there's many ways to see and understand the same situation. So if it becomes a critical incident for us, mostly those critical incidents aren't joyous occasions. Some people choose, things that went particularly well, but most people focus on a problem, something that didn't go as they planned, something that, they felt disempowered within, or, they weren't happy about. And so the critical incident, the construction that they have, is not serving them in that sense. So there's already kind of an incentive for them to let some aspects of it go. And I guess if we, our assumptions, we tend to believe what we see. Well, we tend to see what we believe rather than believe what we see, if you like. And so we really take that interpretive lens to task and think, well, why is it that I see this situation in this way? What is it about my biography that leads me to interpret particular social phenomena through this lens and come up with this as an outcome? And so that's a really interesting process, because it often shows up, implicit racism, sexism, or, lots of neoliberal assumptions as well. I'm thinking about a particular, article that I wrote with Charlie O'Brien, who was a graduate of QUT now, but he, practitioner who was absolutely committed to critical practice, and had all the language and analysis around that, found himself in an organisation where this annoying, pesky service user was really, pushing his boundaries. And so she wanted essentially help and advice from him around Centrelink, which is like our welfare payment organisation, and he, kind of felt that he'd already given her enough time for this week. And even though she had a diagnosis of mental health and there was recent domestic violence stuff and trauma, and assisting her with those forms to get income relief would have absolutely been in his brief, he chose instead to construct her as a problematic service user that was violating professional boundaries. And so he was seeking instruction on how to impose control, put in boundaries, put her off, basically. And he described, a pretty harrowing story to listen to when you have a different lens about it, about how this very tearful service user kind of hung up the phone and didn't know how she was going to get support for that day. And so the questions became about, well, you're seeing this as a boundary construction, as a boundary violation, but how would it, how would your analysis be different if you saw this service user as worthy of your time? How would it be different if you saw that your role was to assist her to access resources rather than control and make her learn the boundaries that you're imposing? How would it be different if you didn't see her as taking more of the organisation's scarce resources? And what discourses are you buying into about the scarcity of resources? And, how might you advocate within your organisation for service users to access those resources? How might you position yourself? How might your practice have been different if you position yourself as a resource to be able to assist this woman with what she needs? And so it led to a very different kind of analysis for him, where he realised actually the boundary violation construction was, one received basically from an organisation that is under constraint and always seeking to not give service users more than what their fair share, when in fact the purpose that we exist as social workers is in service to those people who come to us for help. So there is no other purpose. That's I don't know how we've come to think that our role is to protect our time from these annoying service users.
Control rationing.
Yeah. So being able to critically reflect on that, I do think is really important for practitioners to make better choices, to connect with critical theory, to understand that their role is about trying to support rather than control. And that has, obviously critical implications. It's more consistent with the social justice framework that we espouse often, but may fall short of implementing in practice.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You remind me of when I first, I guess you'd say, became a social worker, but before I ever even really knew what the term was, I used to work in and eventually supervise the juvenile treatment, inpatient juvenile treatment facility. And this was in the state of Utah, but none of our kids were from Utah. They were from the West or the East Coast or from indigenous areas. Utah is a very homogenous type of place. Most of the population is either LDS Mormon or has ties to it, and pretty much at least somewhat reflects those values to some degree. And the treatment facility that I worked at had a lot of really good people that wanted good things for the kids, and they had some people that were not so great, but most of the people that worked there had very good intentions. And when I look back and I reflect on it from what I know now, the main problem as I see it is that they were bringing all these kids that didn't share the same values as people in Utah typically do, and they were trying to mold them into becoming a good citizen of Utah, for example. And it didn't, I shouldn't say it didn't usually, almost never did it align with that kid's life experience, where they were going to go back to, what they thought, what they believed, all of that. And so a lot of our time, I felt, was essentially we were wasting our energy collectively trying to mold these kids through rules and regulations and punishments and all this, instead of looking at them as a valuable human being for who they were right now and trying to meet them where they were. And I think what you're getting at with, if we were able to reflect critically, we would have been able to look a little bit deeper at the systems around that were between the interstate, the corporations that were making money off of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'd be able to critically reflect on the homogeneity of Utah and how that might not be valuable for many of the kids that we work with. So I appreciate that story. And I wanted to back up a little bit one more time, and let's go back to some of these words, because I think we get confused in America, in the United States of America, because words like neoliberal and, say, conservative, they don't 100% align with the political parties that they're affiliated with. Often, I'm not saying they don't ever. Neoliberalism has very conservative values in a lot of ways, and that's essentially the Democratic Party, from my perspective here in the USA. Can you help us understand what those words, what is neoliberalism versus conservatism versus neoconservatives? And you can take that any way you want, but I wonder if we might just open the door a little bit to help folks understand what we're talking about.
Well, the neoliberalism, yeah, big word. It's a rich word, like revolution, in fact. I mean, it's a very rich term and a very contested term at times. But I think essentially neoliberalism is the dominant state-sponsored discourse of capitalism today in most Western countries. And there is a bit of variation in there. There are degrees of neoliberalism. It's essentially using it's a belief. It rests on a belief, or a number of beliefs, but one that stands out is that a market is the best way to deliver human goods, be they material or social or moral. That a market system, a competitive market system, the more it simulates a market model and the managerial techniques needed to implement that model, the better the social good and the economic good, of course.
Can I just say, in relation to social work practice, the way that shows up is in organisations, rather than the value of the work that social workers do having, intrinsic value that's linked to social justice and human rights, where instead our organisations are looking to pursue value for money, efficiency. That has led to a reduction in services, that narrowing of practice that we were talking about before. I know when I started as a social worker in the field, I was in sexual assault and I had counsellor in my role, but I also had advocate in my role. Counsellor advocate was my role, and I also had an organisation with an explicit mandate about social change. We all had a community education and development part of our time embedded into our role, because it was seen that working with individuals must also be accompanied by working alongside challenging and changing patriarchal structures that were implicated in causing sexual violence against women and children. So there was, that explicit kind of, value base, whereas now the value base, we worked in a university that said, well, our educational values are about corporate values. And so, when your emphasis becomes on money, on making money, on seeing social work as a business, those kind of things can occur. And alongside that, one of the most destructive elements of neoliberalism, I think, is the victim-blaming discourses that come in, because if we blame the victim for the structural oppression that they experience, then we don't need to do anything about those structures. And so that's why it links to conservative discourses, because we would say that that's about keeping the status quo rather than challenging that status quo.
If I could add one more thing, I mean, of course, that victim-blaming, individualising responsibility discourse, it's older than neoliberalism. It goes back to liberalism in the 19th century, and neo just means new. It's a shift in liberal discourse and practice. 19th century liberalism, its explanation of poverty, of course, that it's the result of poor individual choices or poor character of the individual, ignoring completely the social structures, the economic structures into which we're born and have no choice in, and how some people are born into impoverished conditions where they get no education, get no access
and
to
others
it.
have privilege.
And others are privileged, yes, absolutely. And I think what happened in the course of the early part of the 20th century, and I think it happened in the New Deal in the United States and with various Labor governments in Australia and the UK, there was a kind of compromise, a social democratic restraint on the full-blown operation of liberalism in social policy, and we had social provision in areas like, and again it varies, education, public education, healthcare, which came very late in Australia, and a number of social services. So there was this idea that the state had a role to participate and provide for those where markets could not. But neoliberalism, the new liberalism, is rolling back that state, aggressively rolling back that state provision, direct provision, and trying to model it on a market system. And I think it's now very clear that that's failing. It's producing all sorts of perverse outcomes, and we have greater inequality. We haven't solved any of the problems that those social services exist for. So it's the new liberalism that rolls back state provision in those areas we once presumed was the responsibility of the state in health and education. And now we're saying no, individuals and markets will solve it all. They're much more efficient. And I think that's a recipe for disaster, and we're seeing it in social work. We're seeing it in higher education, the consequences of this corporate capitalist model. And it's not free of the state. In fact, the state is complicit. The state is, and I think that's part of the difference, the state is active in setting up simulated markets and competition, and encouraging competition, even where it's positively destructive in the provision of healthcare, social care. So I hope that's helpful in laying out this complex phenomena of neoliberalism.
No, I thought it was great, and I think there's no perfect way to explain it, especially when you don't know your audience and you're trying to, build a foundation. I thought it was great. And I think a key word that you both mentioned a couple of times was efficiency. And you hear that word often in social work in these days. But when we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about efficiently billing for services. We're not talking about efficiently providing social work services.
Can be. That is part of it.
If we can do it in less time, I know in the context of higher education, we're being asked, can you have assignments with less words, because that will be less time in terms of marking. So essentially students will get less feedback on their assignments. And I think it's the same for social work services. When I was a new graduate working in sexual assault, I had effectively unlimited capacity to engage with victim survivors for the duration of however long they wanted to see me. A few years later, we saw an imposition of, you now have 12 sessions, and so you'll only have those 12 sessions unless you can make an argument that you need longer. And I could always find an argument to make, whether this was a recent assault, whether there was a legal case coming up and I needed to remain involved. If people wanted to see me longer, I would find some way to advocate for that. But I think that's very different now. And you know, some practitioners are telling me, look, we get like 10 minutes on the phone and there's people monitoring our phones. And if we're taking longer, then we're going to be subject to punitive, you know, action from our managers who are seeing us as not managing our time effectively, not managing our service users effectively. So I do think, you know, it's not just billing for services, it's also about the way that we deliver services. And within that, of course, you know, the kinds of things that we would think are important as critical practitioners, the advocacy that we might be doing, you know, engaging in critical conversations about the way that structures oppress people and how we might change those, might not have time for those kinds of discussions.
It's not on the agenda.
It's how can we fix you? What do you need? What can we link you to? And how can we refer you off to something else?
As Christine's saying, in the background, this imperative of doing more with less resources. And the reason why there are less resources is not because there's a genuine crisis, but because we are, as a matter of policy, underfunded. So the scarcity is orchestrated.
Yes.
And we have that all the time in higher education, where the government withdraws deliberately the base funding for what is provided. And so...
And likewise in social services.
Yeah, it makes me think talking circles aren't viewed as very efficient by a lot of folks that are in power, because a talking circle, I mean, sometimes I have to put a length on it because we only have so much time in certain situations, but for the most part, a talking circles, from the perspective that I facilitate them, that I was taught, is they're supposed to be inefficient in that way, as in that you're not supposed to time them, you're not supposed to have an agenda.
And they might not have an outcome, and that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. They probably won't have an outcome.
Yes.
To that effect.
Yes. It's about valuing the process, and I think that's where we know if we don't have good process, we won't have good outcomes. But we seem to be shortcutting process, and that has a range of negative implications, I think, for how we do social work.
And I think even in my current position as a assistant professor, so not too long ago, they had some major budget cuts here in Alaska, and a lot of emphasis was placed on efficiency and whatnot in the universities. And for what somebody in my position, a professor of social work, would have done before is they would have taught their 2 semesters, but they would have had the summer to plan and to that's what I would say, basically upgrade your system, upgrade, what you got going on. But I've been here, this would be coming up on the end of my 3rd year, and they cut the summers for budget reasons, but they didn't really cut anything else. So they expect you to be more, what they would say, efficient during the school year, during the 2 semesters. Well, all that planning and stuff, and something that makes someone like me a good professor, because I'm creative and I like to do things differently and test things out, it's almost completely disincentivized and almost not allowed to some degree, because they slam all those other things that we would have done, the administrative work in the summer, the planning. You got to do all that right in the heart of when you're supposed to, in my opinion, when you should be paying attention to your students. And
around that is you just need to manage your time better, and you just need to be more efficient as an academic.
And what that equates to for me means getting that deadline over to whoever that's above me and placing my students on the sideline. And I hear almost all professors say this, in other words, the thing that gets left behind is the grading or this or that, that has to do with direct student interactions or feedback and things like that. And you have to put those to the side so that you can get the stuff that marks your efficiency done immediately. It disincentivizes us to be better professors, better teachers. Very little value is placed on things like student evaluations. And there's very little discourse around things like that. It's mostly, at least in social work, and again, from my perspective, it's mostly about conforming to the syllabi requirements or making sure this is in there, this is there. And it has very little to do with the quality that you're able to implement those things, or the quality of time you spend with your students. Or the
quality of graduates that you produce,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Yeah, as you say, without space for creativity, there's not a capacity, very little capacity to imagine alternatives. Critique must lead to positing alternative possibilities, but you need time to do that.
And likewise, we're supposed to chase money for research, and we're supposed to, pump out an extraordinary amount of publications. But actually, if you want quality scholarship, it takes time, and you do need time to think, and there's no time to think anymore. So that's why we have to, it's almost an act of resistance, a part of being a dissenting social worker, to insist that I am going to think, and I am going to think critically, and I am going to take my time, and I am going to make decisions about which projects I'll get involved in and which ones I won't, and how much, I'm going to be prepared to chase money, which I don't do much of.
That's a quick lesson you learn as a professor or in higher education, right? Is learning how to say no. You say yes a few times when you look back and you're like, I wish I'd have said no.
Yes.
Yeah, well, we've been at it for almost an hour now, so let's go back to a couple of things that I really wanted to talk about. So, like I mentioned before, I'm pretty much the only one in the United States of America that uses revolutionary social work. I don't want to say there's nobody else, but if you do a quick Google search, you're only going to get me and maybe a couple other things in a fringe. And then the other side of it, when I do hear people use it, often it's hard for me to distinguish what they're talking about from critical social work or even radical social work sometimes. Not always, but sometimes I don't see what the difference is. Now, this is just my perspective as I've taken on my own. It was actually before I even came across that revolutionary social work book. And I looked at it as a difference, through all of the work I've done in social work, but with the talking circles and everything. I looked at my imagination of revolutionary social work that distinguishes it from critical social work would be the special emphasis on critical reflection, looking inward, understanding that, yeah, we can go and participate in a movement and we can go participate in a march and we can do all of those things. But actually, the most important thing is that we're making sure that we're revolutionizing in ourselves, meaning critically reflecting, continuously changing, continuously challenging ourselves. Critical social work, we're challenging the systems, looking at that. But I think revolutionary social work, from my perspective, from my space, the difference between revolutionary social work and critical social work, in a nutshell, would be that special emphasis on critical reflection, looking inward as a prerequisite for some of that other change, outward change, systemic change. What is your perspective on what critical social work is, or critical theory, critical pedagogy? And how does the revolutionary side of things distinguish itself?
I suppose what you described as revolutionary social work is what I would talk about as critical social work. I see that critical reflection, transformative internal component as being absolutely fundamental to transforming structures as well. So for us, revolutionary social work had and Phillip did quite a bit of work really mapping out a framework for revolution for that article. So do you want to talk to the
I said at the beginning that social work's a contested tradition, and that we really, to do critical social work, we've got to redefine, challenge the dominant construction of social work. And I think we need to challenge the dominant construction of revolution too, to talk about it meaningfully as something emancipatory in a contemporary society. I think I agree with what you're saying to a large extent, but I think we have to be careful there too. I think we have to honour, the etymology, revolution is revolve, to turn society or institutions upside down when they're doing harm, when they're oppressive. And my position originates in critical theory, which in a nutshell is identifying the sources of oppression, with the obligation in the Marxian tradition and others to posit emancipatory alternatives. And that can't happen without both the internal and the external. And so we can't trade one off against the other. It's got to be both. It's got to be both a transfer. Revolutions, I think it was Ernesto Cardenal, who was a priest revolutionary in Nicaragua, once said that revolution doesn't occur, or massive social transformation doesn't occur outside of individuals, or apart from. Individuals are involved in that transformation, but it's going to be uneven. I suppose so what one needs to be mindful of, I suppose, is when Marx engaged in revolution, he was sick and tired of philosophers who were positing a notion of revolution that was only about changing their consciousness in their heads, but not engaging in activism, in praxis. So he wasn't saying you don't change your consciousness, but he was saying it can't stop there. It's got to translate. That critical reflection has to be able to translate into movements, effective movements for social change. And revolution, its history in the 20th century, when we wrote that article, it has to have a concept. We have to honour that idea of a comprehensive change of society towards goals of equality, democracy, freedom, solidarity, and it has to be a sustainable outcome. So sustainability, today anyone talking about social change has to consider the eco-crisis that social change will be situated within. Unfortunately for me, and some of my colleagues will disagree, but the dominant mode of revolution in the 20th century, it was dominated by a very austere version of orthodox Marxism-Leninism. And so from the Russian Revolution until the Iranian Revolution, all revolutions were led by Marxists in that period. And that form of revolutionary practice required a vanguard elite of professional revolutionaries who basically sought to smash the state. They thought if they could smash state power, obliterate that, and then they would begin to rebuild the democratic egalitarian alternative. And I think any honest appraisal, and people will disagree with me vehemently, any honest appraisal of that project would say, well, they did okay with the first part, smashing the state, demolishing the dominant institutions. It's very difficult, though, to point to a really outstanding example of rebuilding a democratic, genuinely democratic, participatory and egalitarian alternative in which most people would want to live. And there's all sorts of reasons for that as to why that went wrong. And I'm not dismissing Marx. As I said, I think Marx, it's not his solutions, it's the questions that he raises that are really revolutionary, and how we might address those. So we need to do a rethink of revolution. And there are other traditions. If we look around, there are anarchist, libertarian, socialist, all sorts of different ways of doing revolution. And I was very influenced by Eric Olin Wright, an American sociologist who had been a more traditional Marxist, did a lot of work on class inequality. But after 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet model, began to search for new versions of social change, to reinvigorate conceptions of social change on a large scale, and he came up with what's called the Real Utopias Project. And that involved a number of initiatives, not led by a vanguard party that seizes power and then ends up being repressive and never surrenders that or transforms into something more democratic. But can we start building the future in the here and now, in the present? What are the alternative institutions? What do they look like? How would we do healthcare differently? How would we do education differently? And looking at the multiple strategies available to us for beginning that process, for building them, which may involve engagement with the state, a critical engagement with the state. There may be ruptures, but I'm not very hopeful about a grand rupture. Yeah, I think that revolution needs to be considered as something that fluctuates, revolutionary processes, that there are multiple pathways to pursuing a revolutionary agenda, that alternative society based on as I said, principles of equality, freedom, solidarity, sustainability that Wright articulates. And he comes up with examples of non-capitalist, non-oppressive or anti-oppressive institutions or policies, many of which have been experimented with or approximated. Things like a universal basic income that we've never seen fully rolled out, worker-owned cooperatives or worker-controlled organisations, freeware, alternative forms of democracy, citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting. He has this list, extensive list, the solidarity economy that Quebec, several places in Latin America have with social entrepreneurship, non-profits, and that these could form the basis of an alternative model. There are still spaces outside of neoliberalism, outside of capitalism, and we've got to remember those and reclaim those in community with each other. Is it possible that these can be upscaled into a macro-social alternative? I mean, that's the question I pose. I mean, I'm sorry if that's very abstract. But revolution, I still want to hang on to that notion of a large-scale, comprehensive social change. But I agree with you, it won't happen without revolutionary subjects, without our consciousness changing and a genuine understanding of equality, democracy, solidarity and sustainability. That has to change in ourselves. And that's where I think the critically reflective practices that Christine is talking about are really essential. So that both have to go together. I hope that's of some use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, but you mentioned kind of like the idea of the very, revolution, this idea of literally revolving. There's I don't know if you ever heard of the MOVE organization. They were bombed back in the 70s and 80s in Philadelphia. But their leader was named John Africa. And he would say something along the lines of, you have to constantly revolutionize yourselves. If your heart didn't revolutionize, if your lungs didn't continuously revolutionize, you would die. He's talking about continuously revolutionizing yourself. And then there's a Jamaican Rastafarian artist. Her name's Janine Cunningham. And she talks about, the importance of shaking up your consciousness whenever you start to take things for granted and whatnot, no matter how enlightened or whatever, you got to consciously, or you have to shake up your consciousness once in a while and let it all settle again so you can look at it. And when I look at social work, and again, this is from a perspective of the United States of America, social work hasn't had any kind, I shouldn't say any kind, but it hasn't had a real large-scale shake-up, a revolution in a very, very long time. You're getting more and more programs, more and more of this, more and more of that. But essentially, it's built upon the same foundation built by Jane Addams and whoever, covering the same history, the same ideas over and over and over again, and just adding more and more programs, more and more solutions in that regard, more and more ties to the state. And at least here in the United States of America, in my opinion, that's what social work needs, is a shakeup. It needs to completely be turned around and reevaluate itself. And there were two more things that I really wanted to talk about. I know we're on time. But one of those ties into, Philip, I've seen you engage with this on social media just a little bit. I haven't seen you around that much. But I saw somebody, I can't remember the exact context, but it was regarding Israel and Palestine. And somebody said something to you. And I was really appreciative of the way that you responded. You responded thoughtfully, but you were firm. I just felt like you were able to stand firm, but without dismissing them and acknowledging their thoughts and their concerns. And I really appreciated that. And I think in social work, the reason I wanted to bring this up here is because when I bring up Israel, Gaza, Israel, Palestine stuff, it's like most people in social work either are going to write me hate mail on it or they're going to run the other direction. They don't want to engage with it. And we're supposed to be those that are engaging with social justice issues. We're supposed to be aware of, but I see very little even discourse or even anything. And in some ways, it makes me ashamed of being a part of being identified with that as a social worker. And I don't know what to do about it. Disheartened by it all is that I don't even think a letter would do anything. I think it would be ignored for the most part.
It's right.
What are your thoughts? How can we engage with this respectively to make a difference, to make sure that even so, making sure my students aren't overlooking it, it's been one of the most challenging things for me over the last year plus is engaging specifically with that topic.
That's almost a different podcast. But yes, it's something that has grieved and angered me. I'm not sure that I've always been as restrained in some of my responses, and then I regret that. I mean, you've got to constantly self-monitor, but the social media space is so oppositional, and I try to avoid just reproducing that by trying to reach the human being, because I know some of those people, and one of the most reactionary is an uncle of mine. I mean, and I try to get back to, well, what was the common human bond here? Can I reach you at some level with the horror or the injustice that's being perpetrated here, and the lies that are being told about, or the distortion, to get us back into a situation of dialogue. And sometimes I fail. I do fail. Occasionally I get through. If it's hard, I mean, because I think people go on to social media in suits of armour. They go on deliberately to engage in combat, and there are moments where you've got to take a firm stand and say no. But you don't need to dishonour or disrespect the person that you're engaged with. You may not respect their point of view, and so I try to focus on the argument or what is being said, or to at least get clarity. And sometimes I did put a post up there in the context of that debate from Rosa Luxemburg, saying sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is speak the truth. When we're so surrounded by misinformation or a discourse that's inherently oppressive and is seeking to justify the slaughter of people, and it's been a very difficult space. I hear what you're saying about, even in social work. I should, I don't have to, but my own positionality is my my grandfather was of Jewish heritage, secularized Jewish heritage, and my great-great-grandfather came from Germany. So, my family could have well been caught up in the Holocaust had they stayed in Germany and not migrated to Australia. So I just say that because I'm very aware of the distrust and people thinking that you're coming some sort of disguised anti-Semitism here. I mean, so I'm grateful that my ancestors migrated. My grandmother died, I think, same year that the State of Israel was established. So, over the years, I've come to appreciate that Judaism and Jewishness is not synonymous with Israel. That Israel, unfortunately, has become an apartheid state, and I am heartened that within social work we have people like Linda Briskman, who is Jewish, identifies with Jewishness, and she, on the heads of schools, put forward a motion, an ethically based statement on behalf of the heads of schools, condemning both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, supporting, calling for a ceasefire. And this was 8 months ago, not that long after this terrible repression began. In this episode of it, it's got a long history, but this current genocide in Gaza. And so I'm thankful for people like that within social work, and I think we will see a growing number.
I was going to say that, just in relation to what you were saying, Christian, about being the person who raises the issue where people look at you like you're from a different planet. I'm often that person in my context as well, and it is a bit dispiriting and it is a bit disheartening at times. But I think it's still important to speak that truth. I think it's still important to raise those ideas, to call people out, to have those questions, and accept that that's part of being the dissenting social worker. It's part of being the revolutionary social worker or the critical social worker. And also understand that people are at their own, they have, they're on their own journey. So you're like a planting seeds. I know when I work sometimes with some more conservative groups and I'm trying to pitch different ideas that are rejected outright initially, over time, things might change. I'm thinking too of the paid placements campaign that I was recently involved in and, was one of the initiators, and trying to lobby my peers on the Australian Council of Heads of Social Work Education to see student poverty as an important issue. And that became, not all of them were cognizant that student poverty was even an issue. Some of them saw it as an issue but couldn't be resolved. Some of them saw that I was attacking fundamentally field education, which is like this, kind of like attacking motherhood. You can't attack field education, and this artificial dichotomy, I suppose, between learning and being paid. And we know that people learn. I learn all the time in the context of my paid work. So why would we use that as an excuse not to pay students and saddle them with all this unpaid labour that's sending them into poverty? So we have, created a national movement that has resulted in the government now saying that they're going to introduce a Commonwealth-funded prac payment for social work, nursing, education students from next year. It won't be perfect. It won't be all that we advocated for, but it's a start. It's something. And those conversations met with an incredible amount of resistance when we first raised them. But we joined with students. We put their voices on a national stage. We held a summit. We engaged with media. We engaged with politicians. We started to see the discourse shift. And alongside in the cost of living crisis, it gained a momentum of its own. Then we started to see allies in unlikely places like in business, and the CEO of a TAFE who's saying, yes, we do have these workforce shortages, so it aligns with other government agendas as well, and we can bring all that together. And suddenly paid placements became something that the Australian government felt that they could implement, even though our own professional body couldn't get on site. We've seen that it was actually easier to get the Commonwealth government to invest or commit to investing billions of dollars annually in supporting 73,000 students to do their placements than it was to get our own professional body to recognise the evidence that students could do their placement hours in less time. But, it's all part of a conversation, and it's all part of the resistance. And I would say what I do in that space is use my critical reflection process to say, well, how am I constructing this? Am I, constructing myself as a lone crusader? Am I, potentially oppositionalizing people who have expressed resistance to my ideas? How does that get in the way of a dialogue that I might have with them to be able to move them along? So it's that thing of wanting to lead broader social movements, wanting to lead that change. You constantly have those blockages and those barriers and those disappointments that could result in self-doubt that just leaves you to give up. And I think that's where I really connect with critical reflection, to be able to keep going and to be able to keep asking those questions and having those difficult conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable. And, in a neoliberal age, we don't have room for dissent. That's seen as unprofessional or problematic somehow. And it's easy to become, seen as troublesome and dismissed as troublesome, I guess. But we have to continue to be troublesome.
Funny how you're right, in the modern world, right? Somebody can get stepped on for their whole life, and then I'm tired of it, then they're the problem for being tired of being stepped on for their whole life and finally speaking up for it. But I'm glad that you brought up your story about paid placements, because that's pretty relevant to me. And I want if you have anything on it, feel free to send it to me. I'd love to look at it, but I'll research it as well. And it just to kind of epitomize of how weird the situation is here, and this was 10 years ago when I was an undergrad, but I was, your non-traditional student that already had a pretty good job beforehand. I was supervising a residential facility. My argument was I thought that they should allow me to get supervision and complete my come through my current position where I had a lot of responsibility. Essentially, I had to quit my job, go and take a demotion, get a job as, or not get a job, but do my practicum internship. And midway through that practicum internship, I don't know what she was called, my supervisor, decided I was really good and petitioned for the university to allow her to hire me on a part-time basis. So they actually allowed me to get paid. They just made me quit my job and all of that. I shouldn't say they made me because it wasn't them. It's the larger system. I'm not dissing anybody individually here. I'm just saying that's absurd that you wouldn't let me do it. I had to quit my job and then, oh, now it's okay because of this circumstance.
It is, and they're the kinds of absurdities that we were trying to bring public consciousness to. And when I started talking to, radio presenters and television presenters about 1,000 hours of unpaid work where people are forced to give up their paid employment in order to do this unpaid work, it was really shocking for people to come to terms with that this is still happening in so many professions. And so, the momentum, as I said, became huge, and we had a whirlwind of activities.
Even some of the conservative radio shock jocks said, "What? It's not already paid?" So it was so counterintuitive that you would do all this work without any remuneration for such a long period.
Yeah, but there were still dominant discourses arguing, no, it's not work, it's learning, and you had that, kind of ridiculous dichotomy that actually.
And the greatest irony,
needs to be rejected.
Irony is this is a profession that claims to be fundamentally about social justice, that plunges many of its students into poverty in order to join the club. Not the ones with privileged backgrounds, of course, who might be able to do it with their parents' support at home, but I think that's increasingly a minority of our social work students too.
It's funny how many different social work programs in the United States, the cost of tuition aligns very closely with exactly how much you can take out via student loans. You know what I'm saying? And the prices have gone up. And so that's more than just make hardships. It often puts social workers, social work students, future social workers into extreme debt that they're going to be burdened with probably forever, if we're honest about it, unless something is done about it. Well, I appreciate the conversation. I got to get going. I feel like I could talk to you forever. We could have, 20 of these conversations. There was one thing that I wanted to just ask your thoughts on before we get out of here. And that's just, as I've mentioned, I kind of feel like I'm swimming alone here in the United States. Not completely, and there's people that are gathering and connecting. Like I said, I shouldn't say nobody talks about revolutionary social, but I don't think people have ever even heard the word or the term. And same thing with critical social work. It's a little bit more common, but it's still, even if you search revolutionary social work, even if you search critical social work, mostly you're going to get me. Now, there's other people that have done things. And Michael Reich was good, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But I just mean, it's a little bit like swimming alone. And I think that part of that problem is just that not that people don't exist, but that we're not all connected in the way that we could or maybe should be. And so just was my question for you. What do you think about, as social workers, some kind of international solidarity? I think you all have that more in the other part of the world. I think you connect with each other a little bit more than we do in America with the outside world. And I just want to know your thoughts on that. How can we come together? And I know there are ways, but what are some other ways and ideas that you might have on how people like you and I can connect on a larger level and share these ideas and push them forward and support each other?
We have had these conversations over the years. Stan used to do transformative, he used to call it transformative social work. And that was based in Vermont. Have you come across the transformative social work movement? So he used to try and pull critical social
Stanley
workers.
Whitcomb, is it?
Yeah. Who was involved in sort of the strength-based movement as well.
Yeah, but it was anti-racist. It took on political agendas.
We used to have these conversations about how we'd come together. I guess we used to do more of national conferences and things like that, but we haven't seen any on revolutionary social work, for example. Even just critical, we tend to like going to, European conferences and things like that because they tend to have more critical scholars than, often we think we do in Australia, although there are some very good leading scholars in Australian social work.
the Canadian scene has been more critical. In the past, we draw strength from some of their work. Things like basic income, for example, more radical social policy and diversity. But yeah, look, Social Workers Without Borders, Social Work Without Borders is a movement here that has a journal, Social Dialogue, I think it's called, a magazine type publication. But yeah, look, international networking is really important to us. It has connected us to people like Paul Garrett, for example, and Ian Ferguson, and I'm just trying to think of Stephen Webb, Rudy Roos, a whole range, Masood Kamali, a whole range of fellow travellers, and we don't all agree on everything. Some of them are much more traditional Marxists than I am, for example. But I think it's really important to just keep sowing the seeds that you were talking about, seeds of dissent and emancipatory alternatives.
And your podcast is likely to be connecting people as well.
Yeah, that's the best thing that connects me. That's where I get the most people reaching out to me, obviously. I think, like I said, here in the United States of America, we're just disconnected, and it's hard for me to explain very well, to articulate in a way that makes sense. But it's just very...
Come to Australia, Christian. Come and visit us.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Well, I would love to. That's the first place I ever went outside of the country. It was a good experience, but it was short. But I think... Also, for me, I have a young family, and I've been so busy with everything, is that I haven't been able to get to conferences and whatnot because I have so many other obligations. And so it's also prevented me from connecting in that way, if you know what I mean.
I think
so perhaps in the future.
COVID had a big impact there too. Closest Christine ever got to where you are was a conference in Vancouver, was it, or British Columbia, just the week that we shut down, just before.
Yeah, so I was just there for 72 hours and I had to leave.
Well, thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking the time out of your Sunday, for having the conversation with me, being accessible to my students.
Thanks for having us, Christian.
Thank you, Christian. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.